All right, hello everyone. So, we have the return of the bright light here. Didn't go to the Rose Parade this year. Less rain today, they say more rain tomorrow. So this is now Chapter 2 in the Nature of Order, Degrees of Life. And this is one, so we had talked previously on the nature of order. We had gone over the phenomenon of life and about what this redefinition of life is and why it's practical to architecture. And so here, this is kind of a fun chapter. It starts off with the nature of order eye exam. You can talk about, he has a bunch of these photos, and you say which one, when you look at them, the idea is which one gives you more of a sense of wholeness, more of a sense of being alive. And again, they were talking about the sense of even in situations where there's poverty, there's situation on poverty on one side and situation with poverty on the other. And one has more sense of wholeness and being alive than the other. Similar thing here. You can think to yourself, which of these... There we go. That street running through the woods and a street with street lights. That one's pretty example. You could think this is almost like a Google thing. It's like, click on the ones that has more life. Are you a robot? And here, a little bit more subtle. Two views of maybe even the same stretch of road. And again, the idea is that the one on the left is purported to be the one that has more sense of vibrancy and life. Getting now even more subtle. It's like gets to the real fine part of the eye exam. And this one I quibbled with a little bit. It's tough for me to know because a lot of this is based on what you're actually supposed to be measuring here is the way your instinctive reaction is. And even though there seems to be a more coherent, visible geometry on the one on the right, the feeling for the one on the left, and it's not about measuring the amount of biology there, but it's about gauging your own reaction. And again, in the same place, this is stables, inside the stable, outside of the stable. This one I think is rather important. This one is kind of hard to tell up there with the houses. Tough to say what's going on. This one, two types of cars. This is a very, very important distinction. The one that seems all organic and funky, and then the one that's just kind of more natural, the way that an automobile would be more true to itself. And I suppose this raises the old specter of authenticity. I think that it's a little bit... Everyone goes on, not everyone, a lot of people go on and on about authenticity, quite possibly because it's a reaction to all of the artifice that there is around and all the falseness and the artifice specifically. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with artifice itself. Christopher Alexander might disagree with that. I might disagree with him. I've never had the chance to ask him about that. But you could have when you go see a show, that's genuine artifice. When you see a performer, that's genuine artifice. The type of artifice that isn't good is the type of artifice that holds something back, that covers something up, that is being manipulative. And, being manipulative, it's a trigger word for a lot of people, isn't it? But to persuade someone to make a clear argument saying, I would like to do this, what do you think? That's not manipulation, really, not in the way we think of it. What manipulative would be for someone to say they're presenting one thing while hiding behind it is another. We experience a lot of that, and it's never particularly great. So here we have this kind of art. And no, it's not horrible to do that to a car, but if you're talking about the way that things feel, that this is stilted, full of artifice, and this is more genuinely lively and natural, is the argument made. And even in framing, here, this is to demonstrate that framing can make a difference right over here. There we go. Two views of the same room. And when you're framing over here, that is more lively because you're zooming in to a place of it that is more vibrant, zooming out. Now, if you were designing this interior, this would be useful. You say, oh, it's the same thing. Yeah, it's very useful because then you zoom out and you think, well, wait a minute, that's working nicely. But when you zoom out, aha, and we get into this later with the transformations, with the properties and the transformations, what would a person do to bring vibrancy without fussing it up, without painting clouds on it like the car? What would you do to it in a natural way that would increase that feeling of life? This one I think is very important because it's something that we deal with all the time. It's something that we're surrounded with these ideas of these images of what beauty is, and one of them is a model from Vogue, and one of them is just a candid photo of a young woman. It's at Coney Island. It's just a young woman, looking at her hair in the mirror. And he says that this one is very polished, very stylized, but this one has more of a sense of dynamic, life to it. So that's, again. And then the thing is, in design, what do you want to go for? Do we want to make the magazine architecture? Are we design? Some people do design to be in the magazines, and some people would design for the experience of being there, which I would always want to. I would rather design for the experience of being there than to design for the magazine or for the website. This one is really important. Again, he doesn't say that this is the same space, but this is, again, is the zooming in and the zooming out. And this is also important because he thinks that the one zoomed in has more life and the one zoomed out has less life. And again, it's similar to the bedroom. It's the same place. But you can see then what is working better and what needs more attention in the design. He says lobbies of 2 office buildings, but I think this is like a little... It's like an elementary school teacher trick. There are things like this a few times in this book whereas obviously the caption is wrong, almost waiting there for people to discover it, and that's kind of a fun thing. So there are other photos. There are pictures of an old section of a fence and a new section of a fence. This is another good one. These are 2 views of the same city, 2 views of Shanghai. And one looks more vibrant, and he says, well, what does he say about these? Of these 2 massively built downtown areas, neither are heaven on earth. But still, the left-hand one has some vibrancy, some likelihood of human stories, some intense life lived amid the hardness that one sees in the picture. In the right-hand picture, the hardness runs deeper. It is more, this is a funny way to describe it, it is more anal and sterile and repetitive, and one guesses at and feels less life in that space. So the universal feeling on which these facts are based, he says, I urge you to recognize that the subtle distinction, if you also experience it, as I hope you do, and to me this is like recognizing harmony versus dissonance. Some people are born with a very good ability of noticing it. It's there. The people who don't recognize musical harmony versus musical dissonance, imagine if those people were culturally influential enough to convince everyone else that there was no such thing as musical harmony, no such thing as musical dissonance, no such thing as being out of tune. Imagine that. Out of tune? No, that's just your opinion. I'm not out of tune, you're out of tune. There are some people who are like that. But recognize the subtle distinction if you also experience it, as I hope you do, that it is empirically real, even for cases with even in cases where not much distinction seems to exist, even though in a few cases you may have a different judgment from the one I had made. I do. I still think you will have found that broadly you and I agree, or more even important than that. More important even than the agreement is the fact that this distinction is real, it is empirical, and furthermore, that it is a useful thing to base your framework of design decisions on. And he's saying in historic times, many so-called primitive cultures, it was commonplace for people to understand that different places in the world had different degrees of life or spirit. And that brought to mind something, I think this is my favorite bit in Vitruvius. So the ancient Roman architect writing about the traditions that were even faded in memory to him of how his artistic ancestors, how the ancient Greek masters from whom he purported to have inherited traditions, that he didn't know for sure, but he had only heard stories that they would choose the site of a temple by watching where the cows would graze. If there was a new Greek colony and they wanted to decide to build a temple, they would first let the cows wander around, and then they would see what hill did the cows find favorable and healthy and enjoyable. And so they would choose that hill that the cows liked, but only if it produced cows with healthy livers. And they would you'd pick one of the cows, and then you would inspect its liver, and if everything looked okay, then sure, you got the green light to build a temple there of whatever you were doing. But that it's kind of a quirky Greek colonist in Italy way of doing it, obviously. But the underlying point is that there is this feeling of specialness which you observe and even measure in certain ways. There's certain hallmarks to a vibrancy of a place that are actually definite and there. It says, nevertheless, I suspect that many thoughtful readers will have some difficulty with the nature of these facts. Some may indeed question whether what I call facts are facts, whether the phenomenon I have indicated is reliable. Right, so now we come down to the brass tacks. Last time, the ontology, the epistemology, all that stuff that maybe seemed so abstract. What does this have to do with architecture? This. It has this to do with architecture, the idea of what you consider to be a fact. The difference between feelings and facts, the difference between observing something that triggers a feeling and then thinking that it's not just in your head, that was triggered by something. What does it mean and what do you do about it? This is why the view of the world is so important to how we design. So he talks about how he showed these slideshows to his students one time in 1992 at UC Berkeley, and he showed these two side by side. That's that Botha postmodernist house again in the Bangkok houses, the poorer Bangkok houses, and then said, well, with those side by side, which one do you think has more life? And there were interesting results that some people, when he asked it as a question of fact, everyone was like, oh, what do you mean? But then he switched it around for our heads and said, if you listen to your feeling, what do you think is the, which one has the more of a feeling that it calls up in you of aliveness and vibrancy? And that brings to mind a fun moment when Joseph Campbell, this is in The Power of Myth, with Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyers, that when Joseph Campbell was seeing Star Wars for the first time, when everyone was seeing it for the first time, it was 1977, and in the movie theater, Joseph Campbell was watching it with his son, who I think was probably a teenager. And there's the famous moment, which any of you have seen the movie remember, where Luke has the targeting computer and he's being all rationalist and he's trying to defeat the evil Death Star with rationalism. And it is the climactic moment of Star Wars is a setting aside of over rationalism. It's not a rejection of technology, but it's an embracing of the human capability of feeling. Because what does the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi say? Is trust your feelings, Luke. Use the Force. He says use the Force, but what we forget is that he says trust your feelings. That's the thing that he says. He says no, put away the computer. And Joseph Campbell thought that was very profound. He puts away the targeting computer, and everyone else who would, like, Porkins and everybody else, and like almost there, they failed because they were relying on too much technology. But Luke was the reason why Luke was heroic is that he was able to focus on his human nature, or his, if you believe it, if you want to take it that way, his divinely inspired human nature. And so he succeeds and everyone's happy. But this is, at that moment, Joseph Campbell says, everyone in the theater stood up and applauded. It struck such a nerve that and that was part of why that mythos of Star Wars struck such nerves, is that think about the 60s and 70s and think about how overwhelmed with technological rationalization and mechanization everything was. That's why Darth Vader is the type of villain he is. He's an overly mechanized human. And full of resentment and anger, And so to step back from that unhealthiness and to say, no, our feelings are incredibly important, and we even listen to our feelings to make very important decisions that help people, that's a big thing. And so to do this with design, to trust our feelings, I think is important. So when he reshifted this, when he said, instead of making it about fact, which all the students at Berkeley said, oh, wait a minute, what do you mean? He said, what if we make it about feelings? And he got this result from the poll in the class. 89 said that the Bangkok slum houses had more life. 21 chose to say that the question didn't make sense to them, or that they couldn't or didn't want to make a choice. No one said that the octagonal tower had more life. And that's very interesting. So what he's saying here is that when we look at this in certain ways, I would like to think that he had good methodological sourcing of this, that it was writing things down anonymously instead of raising hands. But, the fact that you had roughly 1/3, or, 89 to 21, it's like roughly 1/3 of them were comfortable enough saying that, they don't want to say. That's worth something. So it's not like there's a social reinforcement of this. That's always a challenge, really, when you're designing in groups, is for there to be if there's a social bias, this is important. If there's a social bias that's reflecting an underlying value. For example, if you're designing a streetscape and people there want it to be a walkable neighborhood, that's a social bias, and that's perfectly fine when they actually want it to be a walkable neighborhood. But if you have a social bias that's getting in the way of what people are actually wanting or what people actually feel, that's something that's difficult to get around. He says, I believe it was not trivial and did not seem trivial to them. I believe that these students were embarrassed by a conflict between the values they were being taught in architecture school and a truth they perceived and could not deny. I think this is very important. I have observed this, that when we're dealing with this type of thought and this type of design methodology, the people who are most resistant to it are the people who have had the highest amount of modernist or postmodernist, especially postmodernist, design education. People who are just clients or lay people seem to kind of get it right away and think, oh, that's interesting, that's nice, and won't say that they don't understand, and then they act in ways that show, yeah, they're not making it up either. They do kind of understand it. And then you try to explain this to someone who's been through design school, and they either disagree with you or say that they don't understand. That's been my experience, and I think it's very interesting, because you're taught to go conceptually, to have something that's that you iterate, and that you have some type of intellectual statement you're making, or something symbolic, something that you're referring to. So all of these things are so abstract and have and end up, I would say, making buildings that you think about instead of buildings that you live in. It's a very important distinction. Skipping on ahead. Page 76, the examples I've given make it rather clear that when we go by feeling, again with the Star Wars thing, there is something at work. We do notice differences in degrees of life in different places, in the smallest aspects of our daily existence. To a large extent, we agree about which cases have more life, and less life. There is a growing suspicion, perhaps shared by the reader, that there may be some structure common to all the examples. This is what he's getting at. Okay, if we can see this distinction, maybe there's something underneath all of this, something important underneath all of this, something we can learn from and then apply. That's what he gets to in the rest of the books. So this next section is very important. It's called My Fundamental Hypothesis. How's that for pay attention to this? And he's stating in italics, I state this by means of the following hypothesis. What we call life is a general condition which exists to some degree or other in every part of space. Brick, stone, grass, river, painting, building, daffodil, human beings, forest, city. And further, the key to this idea is that every part of space, every connected region of space, small or large, has some degree of life, and that this degree of life is well defined, objectively existing, and measurable. There we go. So what would be the hyper-rationalist response to that? Well, that's impossible to have a hypothesis on that because that's not falsifiable. He says, objectively existing and measurable. That is falsifiable. So that's something that someone could do a dissertation on. I had intended my dissertation to be on this, and they wanted me to make it a plot summary instead. So this hypothesis that we can test. I did a case study on this. It's called Method Shapes Morphology. Maybe I'll put a link to that in there in the description below. So we go on next time on Living Process, in the Nature of Order. We go into Chapter 3, Wholeness and the Theory of Centers. He starts to go about what is that fundamental structure that's underneath. How do we understand this? And I believe this is a theory. The exciting part about this is that, as detailed as this is, it's a theory that's incomplete. We're just barely beginning to understand this. So I hope that all of you can look forward to all of that. And yeah, that was my kind of random chatter at the end of this time. Like, share, and subscribe down below, please. You can follow the link to my case study that I made with my former colleague Brian, all about how we might be able to test this kind of thing. It's a type of experiment that you can repeat, that anybody could repeat at any time if you guys want to play along at home. So, yeah, thank you very much, and I am looking forward to the episode tomorrow. Have an excellent day. Thank you.